Wonderful Casablanca back from many, many years ago. It's this just incredible moment. We'll talk about why it relates to parables in just a few moments, but let me just say this. That look that Ilsa, the heroine, gives Victor Laszlo, the guy that gets up and starts doing the singing, that adoring look, that is the look that every guy ever has wanted from his wife or girlfriend, that adoring look. And I get that every time I change a diaper or clean the sink, but I never lead a revolutionary government against another government. I'm just not doing the right things. So we're talking about parables. Parables, stories that Jesus tells, are these subversive narratives. They give us a new way to live, but they actually require from us that we do some work to get to the root of them. The whole point, Jesus said, of parables is they kind of hold you at a little bit of a distance. They don't just give you simple, easy truth. They said, you know what? You're going to have to work for this. You're going to have to dig a little deeper. You're going to have to pull some of the stuff out of it, which is great. Reading the Bible is actually a hard thing. If you're new to church, if this is a new experience for you, reading the Bible is hard. Maybe some of you have picked it up and tried reading it cover to cover, and you've never got more than a couple of books in. It takes work. This Bible was written by lots of different authors over thousands of years. It has all these different types of genre in it. And by genre, what I mean is different styles of writing. And when you pick it and you open it anywhere, what you find is that the interpretation or the way that you read one part might need to be read, you might need to read another part differently. You can't read poetry the same way that you read prose. You can't read historical narratives the way that you might read something else. So every time we dip into this book, we come to it with this sense of like, what is this thing saying? There's so many questions that come up, and those questions are a good thing. Now, you might say that, well, it's simple. I've been in church for ages. You just read the Bible literally. You just take everything it says at face value. And okay, we'll go with you with that for a second, but let me ask you whether you really do. Jesus says at one point in a book called Matthew, if your eye ever lusts or your hand ever sins, cut out your eye or cut off your hand. Did you do it? Or did you give a more reasonable interpretation of what Jesus might have been saying? When you read Psalm 91, it talks about how God will cover you with his wings. Does that mean that God has feathers? Or did you give another more reasonable interpretation of it? We do those things after a while, those of us that have been involved in a faith community, so naturally that we almost forget we've ever done it. And slowly, our ability to look at the Bible and ask good questions disappears. We almost think at our worst, we shouldn't question the Bible at all. There's a wonderful story about a Jewish rabbi who was training some new followers. And he sent them a passage from the Jewish Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, our Old Testament, and said, I want you to take this passage away and come back with any questions that you have. And the three young guys, eager to show the rabbi just how knowledgeable they were, went away and studied. And the first one came back and said, I'm sorry to admit that I have 5 questions about this passage. Second one came back and said, well, I only have 3 questions about this passage. And finally, the third one came back and said, with a sense of victory and the defeat of his colleagues, I only have 2 questions about this passage. And in a moment of anger, the rabbi looked at them and said, how dare you insult the word of God in such a way? I have 96 questions about this passage. The Bible is designed to be this book that's deep and rich and requires doing the hard work. Sometimes that will be painful. Sometimes we have to go back and look at the ways that we've read it and say, man, did I read that right at all? Sometimes we have to do that hard work. In fact, maybe always we should do that hard work. The Bible should raise myriads of questions for us as we wrestle with these texts and figure out what is God trying to say through everyday people like you and I that he chose to write these words. The author Frederick Buechner said, reading the Bible is like standing in the window of a building. And somebody down on the street is pointing above your head, above where the roof of the building would be. And they're yelling and they're excited and they're talking about strange things that they're seeing. And we are stuck in that building. We're trying to understand, what is this that you're talking about? They're talking about things most of us have never seen. We haven't seen God. Most of us, some of us maybe have. We haven't seen some of the incredible stories that the Bible talks about. We're asked to trust these authors and get this sense of what, God, are you saying through them? That requires work. And that's what we find with these parables. They are everyday stories that have incredibly deep truths to them and offer a new way to live. And this is the refrain that we're looking at as we go through these passages. We don't always get to pick the parable that we're living in, but we always get to pick who we are in that parable. As people come into these stories, we see some of them act in ways that God seems to approve of, some of them act in ways that he doesn't. We never get to pick the stories. Some of the parables have stories of pain and suffering, and sometimes we'll find ourselves in those moments. There's a story we looked at a couple of weeks ago about a man lying beaten on the side of the road, and sometimes, if we're honest, we feel like that guy. We don't always get to pick the parable, but we can pick who we are in that parable. God so often presents us new ways of living, and when we wrestle with them, we get to learn, grow, and we get narratives to live by. So today we're going to practice some of that question answering. This parable is wonderful for figuring out new ways to read the Bible because its meaning is difficult. You may have read it before and assumed that you know exactly what it means, but there's some lenses that maybe we read it through that aren't always the correct lens. So if you have a Bible and you want to follow along, you can. It won't come up as text to start with. I'd love you to listen to it, but it's Matthew chapter 25. So it's the first book of the New Testament. It's the first biography or gospel of Jesus' life. And it says this: "Again, the kingdom of heaven will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 more bags. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. 'Master, you see you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. I have gained you 5 more.' His master replied, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness.' The man with 2 bags of gold also came. 'Master,' he said, 'you have entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I have gained 2 more.' His master replied, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness.' Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. 'Master,' he said, 'I knew you were a hard man. You harvest where you have not sown. You gather where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid, and I went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you.' His master replied, 'You lazy, wicked servants. So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed? Well then, you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers, so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. So take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags, for whoever has will be given more, and they will have abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them, and throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Okay, let's pray, because this is a tough one. Jesus, thank you for your presence as we learn that you ask us to come to these texts and ask good questions to learn, to grow. We're not just looking for the right answers, we're looking to learn what you might be saying to us through these stories that potentially change our lives. Okay, so here we go. First part of Matthew 25. So for you kind of Greek nerds out there that you like your word studies and stuff, I feel you, my brothers, I'm one of you. Here we go. Here's a list of things that this passage is talking about. So, the passage centers around this Kyrios, this Lord, this master. He's a wealthy person. He has people that follow him, people that work for him, and he's going on a journey, and he's going to give away all his hypercontra, his stuff. He's amassed this wealth, and he's going to give it to somebody to use, someone to work for him while he's gone. And the wealth it actually talks about, in the passage we read, for some strange reason, it chooses to say bags of gold. In actual fact, if you read the Bible in Greek, it never mentions gold whatsoever, but that's just maybe an easy way for us to understand it. What it actually talks about is this word talenton, or talent. This was like a specific weight of goods. 75 pounds on a scale would be balanced out by stuff on the other side of the scale. And the most common way to measure it would be in silver and or possibly gold, but there wasn't as much gold around. And so when you measured 1 talent, it was around 16 years of wages for an everyday person. And in actual fact, because of how inflation worked, if you were to try and put it in today's money, you'd be talking about something that might weigh about 75 pounds in weight, but would be worth $1.4 million. The parable's designed to be absurd. It's designed to be ridiculous. So I brought with me a bag that weighs about as much as 1 talent of wealth. So, do we have someone who feels particularly strong that wants to come take this off me? Come on, Jake, okay, up you come. Come and give it a shot. I'm going to loosen the straps and, we're going to use your broad shoulders. So just imagine for a second. You're a servant. A doulos is the word. A bondservant. You have no value of your own. You have no ownership rights over yourself. You're just doing what you're told. And this guy comes to you and says, Jake, I am going on a journey, my friend.
Cool.
I would love you to invest my money for me. And then he takes this and he hands it to you like this. And then he says, wait a second, I have 5 more of those for you. Huh? 5 more. Take them and do with them what you will. The first problem this guy has is, how do I get this stuff home? This is a ridiculous amount of weight. It's a ridiculous amount of wealth. And this guy has never seen a fraction of it in his life before. In his life, if he's lucky as a bondservant, and when we read bondservant, it doesn't mean slave in the sense of having no salary. It simply means that he was indentured to this person. You could be a doctor and a slave in the first century. It just meant you didn't have wealth of your own. But this person certainly has no rights to just disappear. He's pledged himself to this guy. And now, this guy says, I am going. Here's more money than you could ever earn in your life. Go and invest it. To the people listening to Jesus' parables, you can take the wealth off now. You can go invest my wealth. You can take the wealth with you if you like. Okay, you got it? No injuries. We don't have workers' comp here. You're not employed.
Can I make a suggestion?
You see that? He slipped. It wasn't my fault.
Buy a camel.
Buy a camel. I love it. That would have been the next step, right? You have this sense of like, I've got to take this now, and I'm off to apparently invest it for this master. This master is entrusting me with millions of dollars in today's terms, and he wants me to go and use it for his good. On the surface of it, the parable is absurd. But every one of Jesus' hearers would have had that moment that we might have had as 8, 9, 10, 15, 30-year-olds, 50-year-olds, where someone says, imagine you won the lottery. What would you buy? And you suddenly start writing your list, like your 8-year-old is asking, how do you spell Lamborghini and stuff like that. It's that dream scenario of like, suddenly I'm wealthy beyond my wildest dreams. Yes, I've got to invest it. I've got this responsibility, but I get to live it up a little bit. To every one of Jesus' listeners, there's that sense of, ooh, this is getting a little interesting. These servants are given this wealth and then told to go invest. Even the one that's just given 1 talent has more than he will earn in years and years of everyday labor. And so then we jump into the story. So let's have a look again. First part of the story. Next slide. The way that it's easiest to read this first is what we might call the Western capitalist region. Now, before you get too sensitive, if you're a political person, don't think that I'm going to rail against the evils of capitalism or anything. There's not going to be any Bolshevik flags or anything waving. But the easiest way to read this on a surface for those of us that have grown up in America or a Western nation in the 20th, 21st century is the Western capitalist reading. So, next slide. Again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on a journey. This master picks out his servants, and based on their abilities, intelligence, or their skill in investing, he says, I'm going to give you a certain amount of my possessions, and I want you to go and get more possessions for me. On the surface, as we read it right now, it's all about wealth. It's all about money. And when the man comes back, the ones he's pleased with are the ones that double the investment that he made in them. So keep going, next slide. After a long time, the master of these servants returned and settled accounts with them again, money term. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. So what could we say about reading it like this? In this reading, this is true. Next slide. The first 2 servants are rewarded for their good stewardship. It's all about money. They have done well, and they will be rewarded. On the surface, we read it, and that's what we get. But the truth is that capitalism and our way of understanding wealth has not actually been around for much time at all. It only really started in around the 18th century. Adam Smith wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, and that was the first time that you started to see this idea that everyday people like you and I with no title, no inheritance, could actually become wealthy. Guys like John Rockefeller started to amass huge fortunes by investing in industry. This idea of growing wealth actually was a new idea to the 18th century. Before that time, wealth was centered around just a few rich, elite people. There's ways that when we read it and read this story about wealth, there's just a chance that we're missing something that we're supposed to read. Next slide. So in this narrative, if we read it this way, the master is good. The first 2 servants are responsible and faithful to their good master. They steward the money well. The third servant is lazy and wicked. He falls short of his master's expectation and receives a just rebuke and punishment. And this parable will be used in churches all over the country on things like Stewardship Sunday to talk about how you must take the money God has given you and invest it wisely. You must take the talents He's given you and invest it wisely. You must take your time that He has given you and invest it wisely. And all of those things are true. Yes, absolutely. God has given you so many good gifts. Take them and use them widely. If you have tons of money, we can use your tons of money. Just give it to us. We'll find a way to use it. If you have tons of time, we can get you working. There's so much things you could do. We could send you out all over the world and get you involved in mission trips and things. And there's so much stuff. Yes, all of those things are definitely true. But I would question whether they were true because of this passage. If we were to take this as our simple reading of the passage, this would be our application. Next slide. To steward what we have well, we are given time, gifts, and wealth, and we are called to use those in the service of Jesus, who is our King. But there's a problem with reading the passage in just this really simple, obvious way. And to understand it a little bit, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about how we understand movies. Next slide. How many of you have seen this movie? Could you say on the surface? Couple, maybe, not many. The movie's called Inside Out. If I tell you the name, could you say that you've seen it then? Inside Out. So if you've seen it multiple times because your kids have forced you to see it, then you could look at this scene and tell me there's a problem with this scene. Anyone at a stretch know what the problem is? Dimitri, what's the problem? The kid hates broccoli. So what's wrong with that picture? There's something else. Anyone else? What's wrong with the picture? It's not broccoli. Dimitri's absolutely right. In the original movie that was played to all American, British, Western audiences, Riley, the central character of the movie, cannot stand broccoli, and we get to watch all her emotions get charged up as she throws this broccoli across the room, spits it out, and yells in her parents' face. But this picture is taken from the movie, and this is not broccoli. This is green pepper. Because when they tested the movie in Japan, and China and Eastern nations, everybody who watched it said, we don't understand. Broccoli isn't despised over here. Broccoli is adored. It's a delicacy. People love broccoli. Why would Riley throw the broccoli across the table? So they changed it to something that was generally considered disgusting. They took green pepper and they put that into the scene to help the people in that country understand. Do you see how a different lens that you see something through may throw a completely different light on a movie that you just watch and take at surface value? Of course kids hate broccoli, and yes they do in America, not in Japan, and not in China. Next slide. This is a movie that came out in 1993, The Madness of King George. It's about King George III of England. When they originally wanted to name the movie, they said, we're going to call it The Madness of King George III. And the producer said, no, we can't. Why? Because American audiences will think that they've missed the first two parts of the trilogy. So instead of calling it The Madness of King George III, they called it The Madness of King George. Next one, this is 2012. It's a remake of a movie from the 90s called Red Dawn. Originally, the bad guys were Chinese people. Back in the 90s, the Chinese market for movies was tiny. Nobody in China was watching movies. The society was almost completely agrarian. Jump on 20 years later, suddenly China has one of the biggest markets in the world. And who wants to go and see themselves as the bad guy? Have you been to see a movie where America's the bad guy? Probably not many of you, maybe Jake has, but other than that, for the most part, we don't go and see movies where we're characterized as the bad guys. So when they came to remake it, they changed it. They put North Korea as the bad guys because no one from North Korea was watching the movie. It's all about the lens that you see the world through. And when you see it through a different lens, it raises all these questions for you, maybe for the first time. And sometimes you just need to twist the story a little bit to get a new insight into it. One of my favorite ones to do this with, and if you're not getting this, I love pop culture, I love these movie little nerdy things, but take a look at this picture. This is from the very wonderful Wizard of Oz. 1939, for the first time, Technicolor bursts onto our screen. Dorothy Gale, her house spins in a whirlwind and lands in the middle of Oz, and she climbs out into this world that suddenly is color on screen for the first time. Dorothy Gale is the hero of the Wizard of Oz, is she not? She takes on this powerful wizard and changes the world around her, except, is she really the hero? Think about it in a different way for a second. I would suggest that it's possible to say that the hero of the Wizard of Oz is not Dorothy Gale of Kansas. The hero of the Wizard of Oz is this lady. Think about it for a second. Dorothy Gale flies a house into your world. She lands on your sister and kills her. And then, to add insult to injury, she steals her shoes and then dances around Oz singing stories about how she killed her sister. If that happened to you, you're out for revenge. The Wicked Witch of the West is simply a misunderstood hero who's simply trying to avenge her dearly departed sister from this tyrant of a 12-year-old who came and killed her and stole her most prized possession. Of course, we know that the Wicked Witch of the West is really evil, absolutely. She's got it in a name. But do you see how twisting stories, how changing them just a little bit, how reading them in the light of a different culture and all those different things suddenly opens up new ways of understanding? Suddenly, like, I'd never thought about that in that respect before. What happens when you take a story like this that we, as good capitalists, who are amassing our wealth, who are progressing in our careers, earning more money, and sharing that as inheritance with our children, what happens when you take that story and give it to someone who's never been brought up in that world at all? Reading number 2, this is how the story is read in South America, or Latin America. The upside-down liberation reading. Next slide. Again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To the one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. Keep going, next slide. While they were listening to this, So, that is Matthew. We've just read that. This is another version of the same parable in a different story about Jesus' life by a guy called Luke. Same parable, slightly different twist. While they were listening to this, he went on to tell them a parable because he was near Jerusalem and people thought that the kingdom of God was going to appear at once. He said, a man of noble birth went to a distant country to have himself appointed king and then return. So he called 10 of his servants and gave them 10 minas. Okay, not talents anymore, but minas, different currency. Put this to work, he said, until I come back. Next slide. In this story, Jesus gives it a slightly different context. He talks about a king that goes off to a distant land, or a man who goes off to a distant land to have himself made king. Now, to everybody listening, this had this immediate political context. A guy called Herod, who you may have heard of in the Christmas story, this was a ruler, a bunch of rulers, Herod and then his son Herod Archelaus, had just gone off to a distant land to have himself made king and then come back. And then when he came back, he killed everyone that didn't support him. So to Jesus' first listeners, suddenly Jesus has given this a context that Matthew's story never gives it. When they hear a guy has gone off to have himself made king, they're like, that was that Herod guy, and he was awful. To them, to these first listeners, Jesus casts the story in the light where the master is not good. The master is wicked. The master has done this awful, awful thing. To us, that seems like a ridiculous construct, but to them, that absolutely made sense. The master is wicked. He goes off to have himself made king, and he leaves these guys in charge, and he says, take my money and go and make me more money. Again, making money makes sense to us. But in Jewish culture, amassing wealth was not a good thing at all, and charging interest was even worse. Let's have a look at these couple of passages from the Old Testament that talk about this kind of thing. The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel. The land of the people of Judah are the vines he delighted in. And he looked for justice but saw bloodshed, for righteousness but heard cries of distress. Woe to you who add house to house, who join field to field until no space is left, and you live alone in the land. Woe to people who just want more stuff, the Old Testament said. Have a look at the next passage. Do not charge a fellow Israelite interest, whether on money or food or anything else that may earn interest. To Jesus' earliest followers, they read this and they were like, ooh, I don't know if I agree with what these people are doing. This was this tension point for them. Who is the good guy and who is the bad guy is sometimes characterized by how we understand how to live in the world around us. Next slide. In a Latin American reading to this group of people who have nothing, what they read is this: the first two servants join their master in his perverse attitudes towards wealth at the expense of others. It's about who is living well and who is being denied that opportunity to live well. And this, to a huge section of the world, is how they understand this parable. And to us, we read it and we're like, what? We don't get that at all. The master is good. The master it represents God, right? And the servants that do well, they're being rewarded justly. Not to a huge section of society, and potentially not to Jesus' earliest readers as well. Keep going, next slide. Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came, Master, he said, I knew you were a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown, gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid. I went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you. His master replied, you wicked, lazy servants, so you knew I harvested where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. Then you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers, so that when I returned, I would have had it back with interest. Again, that thing. The Old Testament talks about interest as this negative thing. Is this really God saying you should go out and get the interest for me from a banker? Next slide. In this understanding, in this different interpretation, the third servant courageously becomes this whistleblower who talks about this evil master who's not living in the way that God would want him to live, and he suffers accordingly at the hands of his master. Keep going. In 2003, there were 3 different institutions that had whistleblowers that appeared out of nowhere, 3 women that became Time Persons of the Year. There was someone at World.com, there was someone at the FBI, and someone at Enron, just at the end of the dot-com bubble. And this is what Time magazine said about these 3 women and how they lived their lives. What we saw in these 3 women was ordinary people from the heartland doing an extraordinary thing, which is telling the truth, and telling the truth because they believed that telling the truth would improve, change, and redeem the institutions that they loved so much. Keep going. In this reading, the master is bad. The first 2 servants join him in his wickedness. The 3rd servant becomes a whistleblower who exposes the ways which the master is not acting like Yahweh, the God of Israel, who isn't only interested in production, who loves generosity and sharing with people, who isn't primarily interested with gaining as much wealth as possible. Do you see how the lens that you come to the Bible with can change dramatically how you read the text? I'm not saying that one of these is right and one of these is wrong. I'm saying that sometimes we come to it and the main thing we bring is loads of assumptions about, oh no, this is what the Bible is all about. In actual fact, if we've learned anything from parables, it should be this. The thing that Jesus talks about the most is very rarely his main point. The fact that he talks about wealth so much should suggest that actually money might not be the main thing on his mind. The whole point of parables was this. Jesus took something that everybody understood, movie clips in terms of today's society, or songs, or things that they encountered all the time, and he threw them alongside spiritual truths. That's the very word, parable. It means to see alongside. He would throw it out, and he would say, think about it like this. That was what he was doing regularly. The fact that he talks about money doesn't mean at all that money is on his mind. And while I understand where both of the readings we've looked at come to, I don't think that's his main point at all. I think there's a 3rd way to think about this that maybe brings in the best of all worlds. Next slide. Let's look at the 3rd reading. Keep going, keep going. In the 2nd reading, our application will be to be wary of the world's systems. We're called to speak bravely even when it's costly to us. The powerful will not receive critique, and the little we have, we may lose. 3rd reading should be next. Third reading is what I would call the historical context reading. And to understand that, we need to understand what Jesus has just been talking about all of the passages before this. He's been talking about the fact that he's going to die, and one day he's going to come back again. Something that nobody had ever done before. I love to characterize it in these terms. If you remember the story about Babe Ruth in the 1937 World Series, there's this story that he points out towards the right field just before a pitch is sent towards him, and he hits this ball right to where he pointed, right into the grandstands. It's the first time in history someone said, I'm gonna call this shot, is what they called it. They said, I'm going to put it there, and he goes and does it. Incredible athletic achievement. But nothing compared to what Jesus does, which is to be the first person in history to say that when I die, I'm going to come back again. Something that nobody at that point had ever done, certainly out of their own power. There were stories of resurrection, but to be someone who came back to life never to die again had never been heard of before. So Jesus, all through this passage, has been working in these terms. He's been saying, no, this is going to happen. I will die. This isn't going to end the way that you might have hoped it would. But then, just wait. I'm going to come back. And then later, he'll talk about, well, no, I'm going to disappear then for a chunk of time, and again, I'm going to come back again. Die once, return to life, disappear for a while, and then wait. Just keep waiting. One day, I'll be back. All of these passages are characterized in these terms. I'll be absent, but I'll come back. In John's gospel, he expresses like this, I won't leave you orphans. Just wait, followers. I'll come back. I'll come back. So when we read these passages, this is the sort of thing that Jesus is talking about. He's telling his followers, he's giving them ways to know that one day I'll come back, one day I'll come back, one day I'll come back. But while I'm gone, it's not going to be easy for you. It's going to be tough. What will you do when I'm not here? Right here, you feel safe. Imagine what it's like to walk with Jesus every single day. You feel safe as anything. But his narrative is, I'm not going to be here all the time. What will you do then? This is what this parable is all about. What happens when Jesus isn't there anymore? Next slide. The man who received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. In those days, if you were investing huge sums of money, people knew who you were investing it for. There was no way that these servants, these everyday people that we talked about, were able to have this kind of wealth. This was a small, close-knit society. As they went out and invest, they were doing it under somebody else's banner. They would be known as the servant of so-and-so who had given all that money and then gone off to a distant land. They were trading under his name. These first 2 servants we read about go out instantly and say, I am declaring for this king who is absent. In the face of any other potential political ruler, in the face of any other lord, I am going to still declare for this guy who can't protect me, who isn't here with me, but I am still for him. The first servant, the whole point, the whole reason they're rewarded is this. They declare allegiance for this king that isn't there. It reminds me, to give it a lovely British-American political concept, of the idea of fish and chips. So if you've been to Britain, you know that fish and chips are very important to us. We wrap fish deep fried with deep fried potatoes in paper, and there's vinegar and salt and all this kind of stuff, and it all gets really squishy and mushy, and we love it. And if you tasted it, you may not. But it made me think about this concept. This fish and chip shop is one of the most famous in Britain. It's in a small beach town called Torquay, and you probably can't read it from there, but what it says is serving fish from 1770. From 1770. This idea of allegiance made me think of this. Imagine if the owner of this fish and chip shop in 1770, who was in business, after the next couple of years said, do you know what? I'm going to keep doing this thing. But there's this political thing going on over the other side of the Atlantic. I'm going to pack down my fish and chip shop, and I'm going to transport it. Instead of Torquay, I'm going to do it in Boston. And I'm going to do it in Boston in 1776. All of this talk about tea parties and throwing tea in the ocean, I don't care about that. I'm declaring allegiance to what I believe in. And not only am I going to set up a fish and chip shop in Boston in 1776, I'm going to call it George's Fish and Chip Shop, because I am for the king. Even if no one else is, I am standing for him. My allegiance is for him. In the face of everything that says don't declare allegiance to this king, in the face of everything that said revolution is coming, in the face of people throwing all the tea in the ocean, in the face of political upheaval, in the face of the birth of a new nation, I, as this one person, I'm going to stand there and I am declaring for this king. And so much do I believe that I'm going to put that across the front of my store, and everybody that comes in here will know this. I am for King George, regardless of what anybody else says. This is the way that these first 2 servants behave. This king is gone, he isn't there. And they say, we don't care if he's here, we don't care what happens, we are for the king. The third servant can't do that. The third servant can't trade under his master's name. He has these questions perhaps. What if he never comes back? What if another king comes and takes his place? What if someone more powerful than he? What if? So he doesn't trade under his master's name. He takes that treasure and he buries it in the dirt. The point of this story is the willingness to be faithful to this master who isn't present. And that is the situation we're in right now, isn't it? Think about this Jesus story, this Jesus narrative. This Jesus who died and rose again, but now has not been on this earth for 2,000 years. For us as a community of people, and if you're on the outside looking in, that's fine, but for us as a community of people, we say this: I am for this king. Still today, I am following him. Still today, what he said matters most. And still today, I believe that one day he'll come back to this earth, and all the things that are messed up and broken, he'll put it to rights. And on the face of it, to people outside, that can sound absurd. But still we stand, and still we say one day the king will come again. We don't bury the thing in the ground. We trade under his banner. That takes faithfulness that this parable talks about being rewarded, that talks about being a good thing. When you read the parable this way, it gets rid of all the whole concerns about wealth and building interest and all those different things. It takes into account that what Jesus is talking about most is believing in something even when it's got hard to believe it. It reminds me of going to Wrigley Field in 2016. Laura and I went for a short anniversary. We went to the home of the Chicago Cubs, and as we're walking around, there's this little old lady sat there. She's a steward, and she's just singing the Cubs songs. This year is the year, is what she's singing. This is the year we're going to win it all. And on the surface, I'm like, man, you've been doing this for 80-something years, and still with passion you sing this year. It's the year. I was going to use the Red Sox in 2004 as an analogy, but I'm a Yankees fan and I hate the Red Sox, so we'll use the Cubs instead. This year, it's the year. She sang that proudly 80 years in to every year it not being the year, and still she believes it. Now, the beautiful thing was that year it genuinely was. That year the Cubs go to the World Series and they win it all. And so few people are around that had seen it before to remember what it was like, but suddenly Chicago it parties like it's never partied before because the Cubs are the World Series champions. And this lady had been believing it for longer than most of us have been alive. This is the heartbeat of this parable. This is the spiritual truth Jesus wants us to get at. Be patient. Keep believing. Keep waiting. Keep trusting. I will not leave you as orphans. I will come again. That, at different times in our lives, will be hard to believe. At times, the temptation is to bury the dirt and not trade under that master's name. The parable says, wait. Keep waiting. Keep waiting, keep waiting, keep waiting. This is what Jesus is getting to. He called us, you and I, to be this thing, this word witnesses. We think of it in a legal term. People who have seen something and then declare it. For some people, you and I will be the only witness to this Jesus that they ever encounter. Keep witnessing, keep declaring. Keep declaring, keep declaring. There'll be times where that message isn't popular. There'll be times where it feels that society is against that message. And Jesus said, keep declaring, keep declaring, keep declaring, keep waiting. Well, like these Cubs fans waiting year after year after year, this is the heartbeat of this parable. It's not primarily about money at all. Does Jesus want you to use your money for good stuff? Yes, there's plenty of other passages that would say that. Does he want you to use your time for good stuff? Yes, there's plenty of other passages that would say that. Does he want you to use your skills? Yes, there's other passages that would say that. But this isn't about that. This is about who's your allegiance to. Will you declare for this king that isn't here, even when it gets tough? So let's just take a moment. I'm going to invite the band to come back on stage. We're just going to take a moment to think about our application, to declare allegiance to Jesus, even when his absence makes it uncomfortable or difficult to do so. We trust in his goodness and stand boldly for him. My question for all of us today is, how is God calling us to respond? That's hopefully always how we take any sermon. How is God calling us to respond? In each of our lives, in our lives away from this community, how is God calling us to live for him this week? How are we called to declare our allegiance? Does that mean we have to stand up and wave a flag and say, hey, this is what I'm doing? No. But there are ways that each of us get to choose to live. That God says, declare your allegiance for me. There's times where it's easier to follow the rest of the world, and God says, declare your allegiance for me. There's times where it's easier to live a different way, and he says, declare your allegiance for me. This is the call to each of us. School, work, college, wherever. We get to live for this king who isn't here, but one day will be. God, as we take a moment to ponder, speak to our hearts, challenge us and change us. Thank you for your narratives, your stories that you cast alongside everyday things that we can understand. Help us to be like those Cubs fans year after year, believing. Thank you for the gifts that you've given us, the money you've given us, the time you've given us. Yes, we want to invest it, but most of all, we want to be witnesses to you. Thank you, Jesus. Amen.